You sit in the quiet after saying no, and the quiet does not feel peaceful yet. It feels strange, almost suspicious. Your body is still braced, as if something bad should happen because you finally chose yourself. The room is calm, but inside you there is a small, old alarm still blinking. You did not scream. You did not fight. You did not collapse. You simply stepped back. And somehow, that is what makes the guilt arrive. It can feel almost ridiculous at first. You chose rest, space, boundaries, a little dignity, a little air. You stopped answering every message immediately. You stopped carrying moods that were never yours. You stopped trying to be the emotional bridge for everyone around you. And yet, after peace comes the ache, a dull, heavy ache that says, maybe I was selfish. Maybe I abandoned someone. Maybe I should have done more. Maybe I should have stayed available a little longer. This is the part that confuses so many empaths. Peace should feel clean. Relief should feel simple. But when you have lived too long as the person who absorbs, smooths, explains, rescues, and forgives, peace can feel like a crime scene. The body does not know how to trust it yet. The nervous system has been trained to call chaos familiar and calm unfamiliar. So when the storm finally stops, the silence can feel like guilt. And that guilt is not always a sign that you did something wrong. Sometimes it is a sign that you stepped out of a role that once kept you emotionally safe. That is the deeper truth. For many empathic people, guilt is not just an emotion. It is a reflex, a conditioned response, a kind of internal leash. You were the one who noticed the tension before anyone else did. You were the one who sensed the shift in the room, the tone in the text, the heaviness behind a smile. You learned to read the atmosphere the way some people read a map. And because you could feel so much, you began to believe that feeling responsible was the same thing as being loving. That is where the trap begins. At first, it looks like kindness. You listen more. You explain more. You soften your voice. You give the benefit of the doubt. You make excuses for the other person's cruelty, distance, inconsistency, or emotional immaturity. You tell yourself that if you are patient enough, understanding enough, gentle enough, then the atmosphere will settle. Then things will improve. Then the person in front of you will finally meet you halfway. But the psyche does not work that simply, especially not when a complex has been activated. Carl Jung understood that a complex is not just a thought or a mood. It is a cluster of emotion, memory, and expectation that lives below the surface and reacts before the conscious mind has time to think. And for an empath, one of the strongest complexes is often the guilt complex. The moment you create a boundary, it rises. The moment you protect your energy, it whispers that you are harsh. The moment you stop over-explaining, it tells you that you are cold. The moment you refuse to fix what was never yours to fix, it accuses you of abandonment. That voice can sound so moral, so reasonable, so mature. But listen closely. It is not always conscience. Sometimes it is conditioning. You may have built a persona around being the good one, the understanding one, the safe one, the one who does not make things difficult, the one who keeps the peace by disappearing a little, the one who says, "It's fine," when it is not fine at all, the one who can hold everyone else together while quietly falling apart inside. A persona is not fake in the childish sense. It is a social mask, a role the psyche creates to survive in the world. But when the persona becomes too rigid, it starts to imprison the person inside it. The good person mask can become a cage made of praise. People call you kind, patient, generous, mature. They admire your softness. They rely on your understanding. And because those words feel like love, you keep giving more of yourself to keep earning them. Then one day you stop. You do not announce it dramatically. You do not need a speech. Sometimes it begins with one unanswered message, one delayed reply, one moment where you do not rush to soothe, one evening where you let the phone stay face down, one conversation where you no longer carry the entire emotional load. And then the guilt comes, because the old pattern has lost its grip. This is where most people misunderstand what is happening. They think the guilt means the boundary was wrong, but often the guilt simply means the boundary is new. There is a difference. New boundaries feel like danger to an old psyche. If you have spent years making yourself useful to remain connected, then peace can feel like loss. If you learned early that love had to be earned through emotional labor, then saying no can feel like betrayal. If you were praised for being the one who never needed much, then needing space can feel like selfishness. But selfishness and self-preservation are not the same thing. This is where the shadow enters. Jung used the word shadow for the parts of ourselves that we do not want to see, do not want to admit, or do not want to associate with our identity. For the empath, the shadow is often not cruelty. It is anger. It is exhaustion. It is the quiet resentment that grows every time you say yes while meaning no. It is the part of you that knows you have been over-functioning. It is the part that is tired of being the emotional container for everyone else's chaos. You may be afraid of that shadow because you have been taught that anger is dangerous. But anger, in its healthy form, is not destruction. It is information. It tells you where your boundary was crossed. It tells you where your dignity was ignored. It tells you where your compassion has become self-erasure. When you choose peace, the shadow does not disappear. It becomes visible. And that visibility can be unsettling, because suddenly you can feel the cost of all the years you spent pretending not to notice. Maybe that is why guilt arrives so quickly. It is easier to feel guilty than to feel the full grief of your own self-abandonment. That is a hard sentence, but it matters. Because underneath the guilt, there is often grief. Grief for the times you were too available to people who were never truly available to you. Grief for the energy you poured into trying to make broken dynamics feel safe. Grief for the version of yourself that believed being needed would eventually become being loved. Grief for the part of you that kept hoping the other person would become gentle if you just stayed gentle enough. And if the relationship involved a manipulative pattern, the guilt can become even more confusing. Not because you are weak, because manipulative dynamics are designed to make your inner compass unreliable. You may be dealing with someone who learned to use emotional pressure, inconsistency, blame, or charm to keep the relationship centered on their needs. Not every difficult person is a narcissist, and it is not necessary to diagnose anyone to understand the pattern. But some relational systems are built around one person's emotional control and the other person's emotional labor. In those systems, your empathy becomes the fuel, your explanations become the bridge, your guilt becomes the chain, and the moment you stop feeding the dynamic, the system reacts. It may react with silence, with withdrawal, with sudden sweetness, with confusion, with a story about how you have changed, with a subtle attempt to make you feel harsh for having boundaries. Sometimes the other person does not even need to say much. Their disappointment alone can feel like punishment, because your psyche has been trained to equate their discomfort with your wrongdoing. That is why empath guilt can be so powerful. It does not just say, you did something bad. It says, you are the reason the peace is broken. But what if peace was never broken by your boundary? What if peace only became visible when the old performance ended? There is a difference between peace and appeasement. Appeasement is when you keep everyone comfortable at the cost of your own inner truth. Peace is when your body no longer has to betray itself to maintain connection. Appeasement looks polite from the outside. Peace feels honest from the inside. The body knows the difference before the mind does. You can feel it in the shoulders, when they finally drop after years of being held up in anticipation. You can feel it in the stomach when it stops nodding itself around other people's moods. You can feel it in the jaw when you no longer need to bite back your truth. You can feel it in the breath when it begins to deepen because you are not constantly preparing for emotional impact. And still, guilt may come. That is because guilt is often the last guardian of the old identity. It stands at the doorway and says, if you cross this line, who will you be now? That is the real question. Not, am I a bad person for choosing peace? But, who am I when I am no longer available to be consumed by other people's chaos? That question can feel terrifying if your identity has been built around emotional usefulness. It can feel like emptiness at first, like a room after the furniture has been removed. But emptiness is not always absence. Sometimes it is space. Space for the self to emerge. Jung called the self the deeper organizing center of the psyche, larger than the ego, wiser than the role you perform, more whole than the identity you defend. The ego says, I must keep everyone okay. The self says, you must become whole. The ego says, stay useful, stay loved. The self says, stay true. And these two voices do not always agree. That is why choosing peace can feel like a psychological rupture. The ego panics because the old strategy is gone. The self is quieter, but it is more real. It does not need applause. It does not need to be understood by everyone. It simply asks for integrity. For the empath, integrity may look like a boundary that others do not celebrate. It may look like leaving a conversation before you are drained. It may look like not answering immediately. It may look like refusing to explain yourself to someone committed to misunderstanding you. It may look like saying, no, I cannot carry this for you, and then letting the discomfort be theirs to hold. That discomfort is important, because if you have been living in a pattern of overgiving, the first sign of healing is often not joy. It is guilt mixed with relief. You feel lighter, and then you feel bad for feeling lighter. You feel calmer, and then you worry that calm means you have become less loving. You stop rescuing, and then you fear you have become cruel. But coldness and clarity are not the same. Distance and indifference are not the same. Boundaries and punishment are not the same. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do is stop participating in a pattern that keeps both people emotionally immature. Sometimes your silence is not rejection. It is an act of psychological truth. Sometimes your refusal to explain yourself is not arrogance. It is the end of self-abandonment. And yes, that can feel like guilt at first, because guilt has been the language of your old loyalty. The deeper wound often begins long before the current relationship. Maybe you were praised for being easy. Maybe you were rewarded for being low maintenance. Maybe your sensitivity made you the one who noticed what others ignored, and then you were expected to handle what others refused to handle. Maybe you learned that your feelings were less important than the atmosphere. Maybe you became the peacekeeper in a home where tension was never named directly, only managed quietly through your nervous system. If that is true, then your current guilt is not just about this one person. It is about the old training underneath it. The psyche repeats what it has not yet understood. That is why the same emotional pattern can appear in different relationships with different faces. The names change, but the role stays familiar. The rescuer, the fixer, the one who overfunctions, the one who feels responsible for emotional weather, the one who confuses loyalty with self-erasure. But the moment you see the pattern, something changes. Not all at once, not magically, but enough to begin. You start noticing the difference between compassion and compulsion, between care and codependency, between support and sacrifice, between being open-hearted and being unprotected, between genuine empathy and the unconscious belief that everyone else's pain is your assignment. That belief is heavy. It makes your life feel like a room full of open tabs, every one of them demanding attention. No wonder peace feels strange. No wonder silence feels guilty. Your whole system has been trained to stay on alert, and yet the body is not wrong for wanting rest. This is where a quiet truth begins to matter. You are not abandoning people when you stop abandoning yourself. Read that again, slowly. You are not abandoning people when you stop abandoning yourself. That is the line guilt does not want you to hear. Because guilt wants you to believe that your value comes from overextending. It wants you to believe that if you are not endlessly available, you are no longer good. But goodness without boundaries becomes a wound. Compassion without self-respect becomes a leak. A leaking cup cannot quench anyone's thirst for long. Some empaths stay in that leaking state for years. They give until they are numb, then feel guilty for numbness, then give again to prove they are still loving. But numbness is often the psyche's emergency brake. It is what happens when the system has been overused past its limit. It is not a moral failure. It is a signal. Maybe you have noticed that the guilt gets louder right after you protect your energy. That is because the old pattern is losing access to you. The psyche interprets loss of access as danger. It says, if you do not return to the old role, something will fall apart. And maybe something does fall apart. but not the way the guilt predicts. What falls apart is the illusion that your overfunctioning was holding everything together. What falls apart is the fantasy that your exhaustion was necessary for love. What falls apart is the story that peace must be earned through suffering. This is the part most people avoid. Because once you stop feeding the dynamic, you have to face the fact that the dynamic was never sustainable. It was only familiar. Familiar is not the same as healthy. Familiar is just what the unconscious knows how to repeat. Jung would say that the unconscious is not your enemy. It is a deeper layer of the psyche that contains what has been forgotten, split off, or never fully lived. Sometimes it compensates for one-sided conscious behavior. If you have been too accommodating, the unconscious may bring anger. If you have been too selfless, the unconscious may bring withdrawal. If you have been too available, the unconscious may bring the need to disappear. Not because you are broken, because the psyche is trying to restore balance. That is why guilt after choosing peace can be a sign of inner correction. The system is adjusting. The old identity is protesting. The deeper self is asking for room. And room is exactly what you need. Not more pressure, not more explanation, not more emotional labor. Room. Room to hear your own thoughts without immediately translating them into someone else's needs. Room to feel your own body without scanning the room for danger. Room to let a message sit unanswered without turning it into a moral trial. Room to say, "I need time," and mean it. Room to let silence be silence. There is a strange freedom in that. At first, silence may feel like emptiness, but after enough time, it becomes a mirror. And in that mirror, you begin to see what was hidden by constant reaction. You see how often you were managing other people's discomfort to avoid your own. You see how frequently you apologize for having limits. You see how many times you called it love when it was really fear of disconnection. That is not something to judge yourself for. It is something to understand. Understanding is where guilt begins to loosen, because guilt thrives in confusion. It feeds on blurred boundaries and emotional fog. Once you can name the pattern, guilt loses some of its authority. You may still feel it, but you no longer obey it automatically. That is a huge shift. If this names something you have never been able to say out loud, write a single sentence for yourself somewhere private. My kindness no longer requires self-betrayal. Let that sentence be simple. No explanation, no defense, just truth. Your kindness does not need self-betrayal to be real. And if you have been afraid that choosing peace makes you less empathetic, consider this. True empathy does not require self-erasure. Real compassion can see another person's pain without becoming responsible for carrying it. Real love can stay open without becoming porous. Real care can have a spine. A boundary is not the opposite of love. In many cases, it is the shape love takes when it grows up. This is why the guilt can be so intense when you first begin to protect your energy. You are not just breaking a habit. You are changing the structure of your identity. You are moving from rescuer to witness, from container to person, from emotional servant to conscious self. That transition is not always graceful. Sometimes it feels clumsy, selfish, even awkward. You may overcorrect. You may feel guilty for not feeling guilty enough. You may wonder if you are becoming hard. But hardness is not what happens when you stop overgiving. Often what happens is that your nervous system finally gets a chance to stop bleeding. There is a difference between a closed heart and a healed one. A closed heart cannot feel. A healed heart can feel without being consumed. That is the goal, not numbness, not revenge. Not superiority, wholeness. And wholeness includes the part of you that still aches for approval. It includes the part that still wants to be seen as good. It includes the part that fears being misunderstood. It includes the part that worries your peace will cost you belonging. Of course it worries. Belonging has often been tied to performance. But belonging that requires self-abandonment is not belonging. It is compliance. You do not need to comply with your own old wound. This is where the work becomes deeply Jungian. Individuation, in Jung's sense, is the process of becoming a more whole, more integrated self. Not a perfect self, not a socially approved self. It means separating from unconscious roles that once kept you safe, but now keep you small. It means recognizing the shadow, withdrawing projections, and no longer living only through the expectations of others. For the empath, individuation may begin the moment you stop assuming that your discomfort is a sign you should return to the old pattern. Sometimes discomfort is exactly the sign that you are moving in the right direction. The psyche resists growth when growth threatens the old identity. That resistance can feel like guilt, fear, loneliness, or the urge to go back and make everything comfortable again. But if you return too quickly, you may lose the very insight that was trying to save you. Peace is not a betrayal of your nature. It is a correction of your overextension. And once you begin to live from that correction, something subtle changes in the way you move through the world. Your yes becomes more honest. Your no becomes more stable. Your silence becomes less reactive and more grounded. You stop performing emotional availability as proof of goodness. You begin to value your own inner weather. The phone can stay silent without becoming a verdict. The room can stay quiet without becoming a threat. The other person's disappointment can remain theirs. You do not have to absorb it to prove you care. That is freedom. Not dramatic freedom. Quiet freedom. The kind that does not need to announce itself. And yes, sometimes the guilt will return. Not because you failed, but because healing is layered. The old complex may still knock on the door. The old persona may still reach for the familiar mask. The old rescuer may still try to take over in moments of stress. When that happens, do not panic. Do not shame yourself. Just notice. Notice the body. Notice the tightening chest. Notice the urge to over-explain. Notice the fantasy that if you just say the right thing, the discomfort will disappear. Then breathe. And let the feeling pass through without turning it into a command. That is how you teach the nervous system something new, not through force, through repetition, through calm recognition. Through honest boundaries that do not need to be dramatic to be real. There is no need to become cold. Coldness is often just pain with armor on it. What you need is not armor, you need clarity. You need enough inner steadiness to let other people have their feelings without making them your job. You need enough self-trust to recognize when guilt is wisdom and when it is just an old wound in disguise. And over time, you will learn the difference. You will learn that some guilt is useful because it points to a real value you may have violated. But much of the guilt that follows peace is not moral insight. It is withdrawal from an old addiction to overfunctioning. It is the echo of a role that no longer fits. You do not have to wear it forever. You can put it down. Maybe that is the real turning point. Not the moment you stop caring, but the moment you stop confusing care with self-sacrifice. Not the moment you become hard, but the moment you become honest. Not the moment you withdraw from love, but the moment you withdraw from the pattern that was draining love out of you. The empath's peace is not a punishment. It is a return to the body that has been speaking in knots and fatigue, a return to the mind that no longer wants to be available to every emotional storm, a return to the heart that can care without collapsing, a return to the self that does not need to earn its right to exist. And when guilt appears again, as it sometimes will, you can meet it differently. You can say, quietly, "I hear you, but I am not going back to self-betrayal just because it feels familiar." That is not cruelty. That is maturity. That is the moment the inner chain begins to break. And perhaps the most important thing to remember is this: choosing peace does not make you less loving. It makes your love more conscious. It makes your yes more meaningful. It makes your no more sacred. It makes your presence less performative and more real. You do not owe endless access to prove your heart. You do not owe emotional labor to remain good. You do not owe your exhaustion to anyone. If someone only feels your value when you are overextending, then your peace will feel like a loss to them. But loss is not always harm. Sometimes it is the end of a pattern that should have ended long ago. Let the guilt speak, but do not let it lead. Let the silence settle, but do not mistake it for emptiness. Let the body rest. Let the old role loosen. Let the mask fall without panic. And when you look back at the quiet room, at the phone, at the space you created by choosing yourself, remember this: Peace is not the absence of love. For you, peace may be the first honest shape love has taken in a very long time. My kindness no longer requires self-betrayal. My boundary is not a wall. It is the place where I return to myself. And from that place, you do not have to chase anyone's emotional weather again. You can simply breathe, stand still, and know that your peace was never the problem.